This online lecture is a supplemental lecture for Kernell and Jacobson's Chapter 6 on Congress. While we dedicated 3 classes to the chapter, the material was so dense that I thought an additional online lecture might be helpful for some of you. We'll start on slide 13 and begin by discussing how the House is apportioned. Remember that all of this information can be found in your book, but this lecture may be helpful to those who are auditory learners. Now, the House is supposed to represent the population, so the number of representatives needs to grow with the population size in the U.S. Remember also that the Senate is never reapportioned. It doesn't need to be reapportioned because each of the 50 states are apportioned equally, where each state is represented by 2 senators. You should be thinking right now about the Great Compromise. Because the population in the U.S. is so large now, we have more members in the House than the first Congress, of course. In 1790, when the first census took place, each state was allotted 1 House member for every 33,000 inhabitants, for a total of 105 seats. In 1911, though, the total membership in the House was fixed to stay at 435, and that's where it is today, because the House members believed any larger of a House would be unproductive for policymaking. So even though these seats may be redistributed after a census, the number of representatives will not ever exceed 435 unless Congress changes that. Seats are redistributed now based on population shifts, which is why I mentioned the census. So the census is conducted every 10 years, and it's an undertaking of the federal government. But once an additional seat or seats are redistributed to the states, the state legislature then takes the responsibility of drawing that divide and creating a new territory to make the represent. Let me back up. Not creating a new territory, but creating new lines into that requisite number of districts. Some states, though, don't allow the legislatures to do that. They'll instead have a committee that does that in order to prevent gerrymandering and make it fair. Now take a look at this slide of the reallocation of congressional districts after the most recent census. This was based on population, so this was the 2010 census. So based on population growth, seats are taken away from some states, like you see New York, Missouri, or Ohio. All of these states are yellow, indicating that they had seats taken away, and distributed to the states that experienced more growth over the past 10 years, like Florida and Washington. You see these states are colored blue, which means that they gained states. So the gray states experienced no changes in apportionment. And the purpose of reapportionment is to create a scenario of equal representation. It's difficult for every person to be equally represented, but this is an effort made nonetheless. So when it comes to redrawing and dividing state territory into the right number of districts, the state is very careful to note that each district in its state must have equal populations. This rule that each district must have equal populations was decided in a Supreme Court decision in the case of Westbury v. Sanders in 1964. There's another area, too, where states must be very careful when redrawing districts. They must try to ensure that all people groups are represented. People groups meaning ethnicities or races. Now, sometimes, actually most of the time, people groups tend to live close together, or they might live in areas where the pattern is really difficult for the state to create a district that really represents that people group. But states also have to be careful not to dilute minority groups, right? So states must be careful not to draw district lines in a way that purposely separates the groups so that a representative doesn't support their interests. So this goes back to the idea that we want equal representation as much as possible. So this balance right here comes from another Supreme Court ruling Thornburg v. Gingles in 1986. Now, in this same court case, the court decided that states cannot draw districts with race as the major consideration to the shape of the district. So, once again, the Supreme Court case stated that states had to be careful not to dilute minority interests. So they can't draw district lines in a way that separates groups purposefully to the point that they don't have a representative to support their interests. On the other hand, this same Supreme Court case decided that states can't draw districts with race as the major consideration to the shape of the district. In fact, this is the form of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the process of drawing legislative districts in a way to give one party a disproportionately large share of seats for the share of votes its candidates win, or creating a district so that your interest or your party wins the election. This term, gerrymandering, originated in 1812 when Elbridge Gerry redrew district lines in Massachusetts in order to benefit his Democratic-Republican Party. Now, after he drew the lines, people remarked that the district that he drew looked like a salamander because it was just so unorthodox. It was obviously gerrymandered because of how weird it looked. So, gerrymander then, the word, is a combination of Gerry from Elbridge Gerry and salamander. And in fact, an artist from the time drew a head, so to speak, to show the likeness to the lizard, and you'll see a picture of it on this slide. North Carolina got to experience the meaning of the Supreme Court ruling in Thornburg v. Gingles in 1991. Now, this is just after the 1990 census. In 1991, North Carolina tried to draw its first congressional district for a population of African Americans. And you can see their effort to do this is depicted on the top drawing on this slide. The blue area is the district drawn with African American community in mind. The court actually rejected that drawing, but accepted the other version depicted at the bottom picture on the slide. Now, after hearing the definition of gerrymandering, that legislative districts are drawn in a way that gives one party a better chance of winning, and after hearing about the court case, Thornburg v. Gingles and the North Carolina's redistricting after 1990 census, you probably noticed that there are kind of two types of gerrymandering. That is, there's partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. Now, in terms of gerrymandering, the court ruled in Davis v. Vandimer in 1986 that a gerrymander would be unconstitutional if it were too unfair to one of the parties. But this court ruling has yet to be put to the test because no one has yet run afoul of the ruling. The next slide discusses the interesting apportionment feature of the Senate. Remember, the Senate is never reapportioned because the purpose of it is that they are equally apportioned. Again, think the Great Compromise. Now, it doesn't need reapportionment, again, because each of the 50 states should be apportioned equally, where 2 senators represent each state. Yet, representation in terms of populations are greatly skewed in the Senate, meaning that representation is quite uneven. Here's what I mean. The Senate is what we would call malapportioned. So the apportionment of the Senate seems uneven when we think or consider that Wyoming and California have the same number of senators, each of them have 2, but California is tremendously larger than Wyoming. California has a population of about 37 million, while Wyoming has a population of 564,000. And some people think this isn't fair. But when you consider that our founders intended the Senate to be a minority check on the majority power, you can see the structure of the Senate is really doing just that. It's creating a minority check on the majority. Because it also happens that smaller, rural, less populated states are usually composed of Republicans, while really densely populated urban states primarily consist of Democrats. But there are more rural states. So in that case, the Republicans would gain the advantage from equal representation in the Senate. Now, when your book mentions electoral politics, it's talking about the politics of electing public officials. So it's the relationship of the electoral process to our Congress. I've mentioned before that congressmen are single-minded seekers of re-election. No matter what their goal is, they can't get it accomplished without being re-elected. And the modern Congress is organized to serve the goal of its members, which is to get re-elected. Now, it's important to remember that electoral imperatives, by that I mean the drive to get reelected and everything that entails, that imperative shapes all important aspects of congressional life. On a really broad level, our electoral politics have either tended to be what your book calls candidate-centered or party-centered. And it's kind of shifted throughout history. Early on, the systems or the electoral system, rather, kind of leaned toward party-centered electoral politics because voting on the party line was really prevalent. So voters would base their choices based on the candidate's party and not the candidate himself or herself. A few changes, though, in the process and the law placed the emphasis off party and onto the candidate, where candidates were the focus of the election and not the parties. So now we have, well, at that point we had candidate-centered politics. And that's an encouragement of electoral politics in which candidates operated largely as like an independent political entrepreneur. So Congress members would emphasize their individual character, their individual legislative performance, their constituency services to their district or state in their campaigns. And, of course, they encouraged voters, and this inherently encouraged voters, to use this individualistic criteria when deciding who to vote for, instead of just voting on the party line. So I mentioned that, changes in the process and law place the emphasis off party and onto the candidate. So the changes in law that I referred to that made our system more candidate-centered politics are listed here on this slide. The introduction of primary elections made it where parties had less control during the nomination process because voters selected who the nominee was. Now it wasn't just selected by the party machine in a smoke-filled room away from the public. So now the public has control, right? Also, the rise of special interest groups introduced a new player in political organizations. So again, this is special interest groups are kind of another access point for individuals to get involved in the process. Now, parties are not because of the interest group interests, parties aren't the only one in control of political organization. Parties also lost control of the media because of increased competition and different kinds of media outlets. So the voters have really a lot more information coming from, maybe not so much unbiased sources, but sources that are not just based on party. So let's go back really quickly to the results of the change from party-centered elections to candidate-centered elections. The result of the candidate-centered election is that members of both parties won election to Congress and stayed there due to their own efforts. So that's the results for the candidate-centered elections. Now, many said that they recruited themselves to run for office with only the desire to represent their districts. And in these candidate-centered elections, you have a lot of people bragging on organizing their own campaigns, raising their own money, as opposed to receiving money primarily from their party or a political action committee. While many still run under the party label, and that's the norm, campaigns were very personal and centered on local interests and values. It's important to note, though, that currently we're seeing party-centered politics come back into play. This may be the case because party polarization seems to be taking place in Congress and, of course, in the electorate, too. The result is that congressmen find it more difficult to get to common ground in terms of legislation. So it creates legislative gridlock where legislation just doesn't get passed. this political polarization, because both sides, Democrats and Republicans, are so far away from each other in terms of ideology. Now here on this slide, I discuss the advantages of being an incumbent. So we call this the incumbency advantage. And I was able to discuss this pretty thoroughly in class, so I'll make this part of the lecture really brief. Basically, if you're an incumbent, you're really likely to get reelected again if you run for office, but it's not simply because you are an incumbent that it's easy to get reelected. Instead, it just so happens that an incumbent accrues advantages from the diligent use of the many resources that come with holding office. For example, congressmen can actually vote to give themselves greater resources for servicing their districts, which helps them get reelected. So if you're a congressman, you can vote yourself more money for staff, travel, local offices, communications. So you can start the electoral process really quickly after you've regained office, ready again for that next election. But the incumbency advantage only goes so far. Being involved in a nationwide scandal can certainly lose you the election, no matter how many or much incumbency advantages you have. Now on this next slide, we consider two sometimes conflicting descriptions of a congressperson's job. That is, does a congressperson need to consider only how he or she represents their constituents, or should that congressperson also focus, or primarily focus, on a more national responsibility to all people? Because those two things can be at odds. Representation of your constituency versus responsibility to your nation. In fact, different electoral processes produce different forms of representation that might induce conflict between these two choices. So, and of course, now we're going back to party-centered systems and candidate-centered systems. These are the two forms that typically can cause conflict between representation and responsibility. So remember, in party-centered elections, legislatures represent citizens by carrying out the policies promised by the party, and they're held responsible for their party's performance in governing. And when I say governing, I mean just governing overall, like on a national level. Candidate-centered politics gives the incentive to be individually responsive to a very small, very specific group, rather than be collectively responsible. Candidate-centered politics may seem to be the better form of the two, from, when we discussed it just a moment ago. But in candidate-centered politics, members tend to promote very narrowly targeted programs because they're only focused on one small constituency. So again, the result then is narrowly targeted programs, projects, tax breaks for their constituents without really worrying about the impact of those measures on spending or revenues for the overall nation. Candidate-centered politics also results in pork barrel legislation, earmarks, log rolling. An example of pork barrel legislation and earmarks is a 2002 earmark where the legislature voted for a $500,000 appropriation for the construction of the Sparta Teapot Museum in Sparta, North Carolina. They said that it would help the economy of Sparta. Now, pork barrel legislation is legislation that provides members of Congress with federal projects and programs for their own individual district, which is why I just said that candidate-centered politics encourages pork barrel legislation. It's, again, legislation that provides members of Congress federal projects for their individual district. The earmarks refer to the money set aside by Congress in the federal budget to pay for these projects in the home district. A log roll, that's the result of legislative vote trading, and that's just the way business is done in the legislature. Log rolling is not necessarily a bad thing, but an example might be, so you've got two legislatures representing, one representing urban districts, and this individual may vote for an agricultural bill, even though it doesn't have anything to do with his district. He did that, likely, because a legislator from a rural district said, hey, I'll vote for a mass transit bill if you vote for this. So they trade votes on things that are seemingly disparate interests, but they do it again so they can get the other votes that they want. Vote trading. Slide 28, also entitled Representation versus Responsibility, discusses how the electoral incentive can make legislatures hesitant to pass legislation that passes a direct cost on identifiable groups in order to produce greater but more diffuse benefits to all citizens. So an example of this would be pollution regulation. So it's a concentrated cost, but the benefits are very diffuse. They benefit a ton of people. Free trade is also a great example of this. Again, we have really concentrated costs, but the benefits are really diffused. So let's talk about free trade for a moment. The concentrated costs of free trade are found in losses in factories that experience greatly reduced sales because more competition. You've got other overseas companies making the products cheaper. Now, it's true, a lot of these people will lose their jobs all at once. However, job gains are prevalent too, but they're more spread out and they're harder to see. So some job gains occur at exporting companies that gain sales in other countries who've opened up their markets to our goods. For this reason, it's hard for congressmen to make a decision for the common good if it might be hard to see the common good right away. Again, you've got a large portion of factory workers losing their jobs right away, and it's more difficult to point to all the other people that have gained jobs because they're more dispersed. At least this is what individuals often say about free trade. So I've posted an article about free trade from Forbes on e-learning, and I encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested. Making difficult decisions for the common good can still be achieved. Congressional majorities have been able to solve this dilemma by delegating authority to bureaucratic agencies or state governments, so that the blame for really difficult decisions is taken away from Congress and put on that bureaucratic agency. Take a look at the second bullet point on this slide. Congress can also frame their choice in a way that highlights credit for the general benefits while minimizing individual responsibility for the specific costs. But that might be difficult. So in general, it's up to Congress to make the electoral payoffs from disregarding special interests to benefit a larger, broader public outweigh the costs. So once again, we've got these electoral payoffs that Congress wants, and they've got to make disregarding special interest groups to benefit a broader public outweigh the costs. Now the next few slides are about the basic problems that come with legislative organization. In any group, you'll find collective action problems, and these slides discuss how Congress can solve these. In class on October 7th, I was able to go over these slides in really quite a bit of detail, so I'm going to skip over most of these slides. I'd like to discuss slide 38, entitled Legislative Organization, High Transaction Costs. If you were in class on Friday, you'll remember the refresher I gave on transaction costs, conformity cost, and collective action. Now, as we discuss how bills are passed in Congress, you'll see in more detail how the rules and processes in Congress are designed to alleviate a lot of these collective action issues. For example, a lot of conflict is resolved in the House by having rules in place that make people seem civil. So many of Congress's rules, customs, procedures are aimed at resolving or at least deflecting conflicts so that it can get on with the business of legislating. For example, in the House, they address all remarks to the Speaker. That makes it less confrontational. So they're not pointing people out and calling names and that sort. So the House also delegates the task of building legislative coalitions to party leaders. So we have party whips, minority whips, and which they vote on, these party leaders. So they use this system of political parties, because political parties already kind of separate coalitions in Congress, to have ready-made coalitions. And this solves the issue of coalition building, or having to build a coalition every single time a bill is introduced. There's already a nice divide between Republicans and Democrats. So political parties help solve conflict in Congress, and it also reduces transaction costs, again, because you're not trying to build a new coalition every single time a bill is introduced. Well, the House is much larger than the Senate. And so because of that, organizational problems are really more acutely felt in the House than in the Senate. So the House solves coordination problems by following stricter rules of procedure. And they tolerate a greater control by leaders, again, in order to solve those collective action problems. Both the House and the Senate, though, make following precedent a part of the rules. In addition, seniority is also a criteria they use for leadership roles like committee leaders. And this helps eliminate too much time spent on electing new committee leaders in the committee of the whole. And it reduces transaction cost, and it also helps reduce intra-party squabbling among congresspeople. As I mentioned in class on the last lecture I gave on the legislature, in terms of legislative organization, the most crucial structures that help Congress overcome collective action problems are political parties and the committee system. Again, the most crucial structures that help Congress overcome collective action problems are political parties and the committee system. Getting a majority behind you in the House is really very important, even in the Senate too. In the House and the Senate, decisions are made by a majority vote. But majorities also establish procedures. They choose leaders, decide how to organize their respective houses. To create a majority, one needs to create enough of a coalition, a group of people that are like-minded, that support something. That is a majority. It just so happens, like I mentioned earlier, that political parties are really ready-made coalitions. So here are a group of people who already have general ideology in common, and so it makes sense for that group, the political party, then to stick together as that ready-made coalition. But in order for parties to act as ready-made coalitions, there has to be an incentive for party members to continually keep voting along with what the other party members vote for. And you've got to consider there are instances where they want to defect from their party. There can still be differences in the same party on specific votes. So incentives need to be created, in order to achieve cohesion within the same party. In order for the parties to be ready-made coalitions, we have to make sure that there's something sticking them together. So for this reason, party members give House party leaders resources to be used for inducing members to cooperate when they're tempted to go their own way as free riders. So House party leaders want to make sure that there are no free riders in their party. So they use these resources to induce members to cooperate. Primarily, party separates the coalitions in Congress. I've said this in a few different ways now. So the majority and minority party are synonymous. So the majority and the majority party, that's synonymous, right? The majority party is the majority. The majority party in the House elects a leader called the Speaker of the House. The Speaker is given authority to appoint committees, make rules, manage the legislative processes on majority's behalf. The Speaker's chief assistants are the majority leader and the majority whip. And the minority party has a minority leader and party whips to lead the minority too. The party whips are in charge of rounding up votes for their parties, making sure there's enough support for a bill, coordinating actions among the party, that sort of thing. Now remember, party leaders can give good committee assignments. They have the power to direct the legislative agenda, and I'm speaking primarily of the Speaker of the House, but can also help members with election campaigns, particularly fundraising. It's true that the real power is in the hands of the party that's in power, the majority party. So it begs the question of why Congress has minority party leaders and minority whips. What's their purpose? Well, their job is generally to just oppose the majority party and attack them. Metaphorically, of course. By doing this, the minority is hoping to help themselves look good in future political battles where they might actually win. So they do try to fight back even when they know they won't win, for the purpose of future political battles. Although, if the margin between the majority party and the minority party is close, the minority party might make a difference. When the party balance is really close, minority leaders can sometimes influence legislation by forming alliances with the moderate members of the opposite party, and then they can sway the vote. These party leaders, all of them, are elected at the beginning of every Congress, although you'll see that there's consistency among the party leadership. It behooves a party to keep the same leader in power consistently. Now let's consider the Senate and party organization. Power and influence exerted by Senate leaders depend largely on their political skills and the extent of intra-party divisions. Party leadership in the Senate is more congenial and way less formal than in the House, because there's fewer people. In addition, the minority party has greater influence in the Senate because so much of that body's business is conducted under what we call unanimous consent agreements. These are agreements negotiated by party leaders. So these agreements can govern the order in which bills are considered, the length of debate allotted to them. The thing about unanimous consent agreements is they can be killed by one single objection, just one objection. So they require, again, a lot of coordination because one person not wanting it can just kill the unanimous consent agreement altogether. These next slides show the party committees and party leaders or House leaders. The next slide shows the same for the Senate. Of course, the most important of these positions are for the House, the Speaker of the House, and for the Senate Majority Leader. Remember, the most crucial structures that help Congress overcome collective action problems are political parties and the committee system. The committee system is subject to the majority party. Essentially, these two structures, committees and political parties, are really closely integrated, and each is mutually dependent on the other. The majority party is powerful because of its control over the committee system, and the importance of the committees is perpetuated by political parties and vice versa. So the committee system has, like all of government, expanded greatly. There's more committees now than there were originally. The first Congress delegated authority to committees really sparingly. Instead of referring bills to committees, this early Congress would do their work in a committee of the whole. And in this committee of the whole, the entire body would act as a committee. There was a lot more flexible rules in that scenario. So in the committee of the whole, they would frame a piece of legislation, elect a temporary committee to draft the bill, then debate and amend the bill line by line, and the House would vote on the bill. So overall, this is a very cumbersome process because it took a lot of people to do, or it involved a lot of people to accomplish it. And as Congress began taking up more legislation, this legislation that came from the Committee of the Whole became even more cumbersome and really not possible. In 1809, the House had 10 permanent committees, and by 1825, 28 House committees were in place. Now, early on, congressmen were elected to serve on these committees, but soon, committee members were just appointed by the Speaker. That's how we know it today. And that greatly reduced transaction costs, freed up a lot of time, instead of at the beginning of every Congress, there being a series where the entire House elects who's going to be on what committee. Now the Speaker just points them to be on which committee. Later, as the Speaker emerged as leader of the majority party, appointments to committees became very partisan-based. Now here we see the intermingling of these two crucial structures of parties and committees. And once again, parties, committees intertwining here. The best committee positions became rewards for party loyalty. So here this created another resource for speakers to use as an incentive to keep their parties in line. So best committee positions became rewards for party loyalty and even bargaining chips for those pursuing the office of the Speaker. The Senate was a little slower to set up permanent committees. But despite their small numbers and lighter workload, the senators eventually turned to standing committees. Now, standing committees exist from one Congress to the next unless they are officially disbanded. So in the Senate, the seniority rule became the criterion for selecting committee chairs. That is, the person who served the longest time. So again, office rewarded to the majority party member with the longest tenure in the committee. This avoided inter-party squabbles, kept power out of the hands of party leaders, made the decision on who became committee chair much easier. Now, standing committees of the House and Senate are those that exist from Congress to the next unless disbanded. Both chambers have standing committees. The committees, they really embody Congress's division of legislative labor. They have fixed jurisdiction, stable memberships, and it facilitates congressmen to specialize in certain policy areas, usually areas that have to do with their constituency. If a congressperson is from a rural state, you'll see that congressperson wanting to be on the Agriculture Committee. Members can leave committees, and they'll want to do this generally for a position on a committee considered more important and influential. These important, influential committees are just the money committees, very important. So a few of the most coveted committees are the Ways and Means, Appropriations Committee in the House, or the Finance and Appropriations Committee in the Senate. Also, the House and Senate budget committees are very important. Congress also forms special, select, joint, ad hoc, and conference committees. These are different from standing committees. Most special and select committees are appointed to deal with their specific problem, then they disappear once the problem's solved. Joint committees are permanent committees composed of members from both chambers. Leadership positions rotate between the chambers at the beginning of each Congress. But these are committees that have relatively low authority. Like the library, for example, this oversees, the Library Joint Committee oversees the Library of Congress. The Joint Committee of Printing oversees the Government Printing Office. So these committees in general just gather information, oversee the executive. They're not reporting legislation. These next slides cover how legislation is passed. Of course, the first step in legislating is to draft a proposal. Anybody can draft a piece of legislation. You can, I can, an industry can. The president can draft legislation if he or she wants, but only members of Congress may officially propose legislation to the House or the Senate for consideration. So many bills actually are introduced, but very few bills become law. Sometimes members of Congress just submit legislation knowing it won't pass, but he or she may want to kind of stake out political positions or make a political statement. The parties are known to do this, and the president can also use legislative proposals for this reason too. Again, just to kind of see where the public stands. Once a bill is introduced, it's assigned to a committee. The committee is the workhorse of the legislative branch. This is where most of the action takes place, or for the most part, actually, inaction. I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. After a bill is introduced, it's assigned a number referred to a committee. In the House, it's HR, whatever number. In the Senate, it's S, whatever number they've numbered the bill. Now, in the House, bills are referred to to a committee by the Speaker. Once the bill has been referred by the Speaker to the committee, the most common thing that happens next is absolutely nothing. Most bills never make it out of committee. That's why I said most of the action takes place in committee, or rather most of the inaction takes place in a committee. So in the 114th Congress, for example, more than 10,000 laws were introduced. Only 244 were enacted laws. Of course, this doesn't take into account resolutions. Over the past 3 Congresses, less than 5% of the proposed bills were enacted. If a committee decides on further action, again, they can decide on no action at all. The bill may be taken up directly by the full committee, but more commonly, it's referred to the appropriate subcommittee. When we say the full committee, we mean the full standing committee. But there are subcommittees too. If the bill receives action in the committees, then the bill is subjected to the next step in the legislative process, which is hearings. So once the subcommittee decides to act, or it could be the full committee, they may hold hearings, inviting interested people to testify in person or writing about the issue at stake and proposals to deal with it, right? To deal with the issues that they're bringing up. Hearings also provide a formal occasion for Congress to monitor the administration of laws and programs it creates. And the heaviest of this duty falls on the appropriations subcommittees in the House. Because it's here, in these hearings, the agencies have to justify their budget to that committee. In all, these committee hearings, they have a lot of different purposes. They provide an opportunity to make a record for a particular proposal. They can evaluate how well a program is working or simply generate publicity. In fact, this last sentence is a question on the test. So in this question, I pose a sentence and you finish it. This question is congressional hearings. And on the test, you mark the answer, that they provide an opportunity to make a record for a particular proposal, evaluate how well a program is working, or simply generate publicity. Now, after the hearing, the committee or subcommittee will mark up the bill, make amendments, and other changes that they see fit. Then they just write up a report. The full committee then accepts, rejects, or amends the bill. It's important to note that not every bill is subject to this kind of scrutiny. Because again, when I say that most bills don't make it out of committee, I mean that most bills aren't even discussed in committee. They're just set aside. The written report that accompanies the bill once it comes out of committee is the most important source of information on legislation for members of Congress, not on that committee, as well as other people who were interested in the legislation. Many Congress members will follow the recommendation of the committee because they're the resident experts. A lot of Congress members follow the recommendation of the committee, but the bill still will be debated. It still will be discussed. Now, that leads us to the next step on the legislative process, which is scheduling debate, so floor action. When a committee agrees to report on the bill is put on the House or Senate calendar. In the House, the bill goes to the Rules Committee first to receive a resolution that specifies when, how long a bill will be debated, and under what procedures. So even then, the Rules Committee may require some revision of the legislation before allowing it to proceed. The House Rules Committee, which is very powerful as you can see, has 3 types of rules for consideration of a bill: open, restricted, and closed. Open rules are a provision governing the debate of a pending bill that permits any germane amendment to be offered on the floor. So you can submit an amendment, it just has to be affiliated with the legislation in question. Restricted rules are a provision that governs the consideration of a bill, but it specifies and limits the kinds of amendments that may be on the floor. A closed rule is an order from the House Rules Committee that limits floor debate on a particular bill or disallows or limits amendments. Now, but once the Rules Committee grants a rule, it must be adopted by a majority of the House floor. Committees are the legislative filters, okay? But it's still possible to bring a bill directly to the floor without committee approval using a discharge petition. A discharge petition brings a bill directly to the floor without committee approval when signed by a majority of House members, the majority being at least 218. But these are rarely successful. In fact, since 1967, only 12 petitions have received the votes needed. The Senate doesn't have a rules committee, so the leaders of both parties can negotiate unanimous consent agreements. We've talked about these a moment ago. These arrange the orderly consideration of legislation. These are similar to rules in that they limit time for debate, determine which amendments are allowable, provide waivers of Senate rules. In the absence of a unanimous consent agreement, though, there is no limit on debate or the number of amendments for legislation. And this creates the opportunity where senators can filibuster. A filibuster occurs when a senator holds the floor, making endless speeches so that no action can be taken on a bill or anything else for that matter. These filibusters are difficult to break, but they can be stopped by invoking cloture, which stops the filibuster. However, a filibuster requires 3/5 of the Senate. That's 60 votes to invoke cloture, and that's a lot. That's one of the reasons why cloture is rarely invoked. Cloture also allows an additional 30 hours of debate on a bill before the vote is finally taken. In the House, the time for debate is divided equally between the proponents and opponents of a bill. Each side's time is controlled by a floor manager. And if amendments to a bill are allowed under the rule, they must be germane or pertinent to the bill. In these instances, what we call riders, these are extraneous matters or extraneous issues that congressmen try to bring to a bill, they're not allowed. And time is usually restricted in this scenario for about 5 minutes on each side. Generally, though, these floor debates, they don't change the minds of people. Politicians are rarely swayed by words. They already know how they're voting. Mostly, Congress members use this time for political posturing, so they can justify their votes to constituents. In the Senate, floor action does a little more to shape legislation, and bills can change on the Senate floor more than they can in the House, because in the Senate, amendments do not need to be germane to the bill. Once a bill is passed in one chamber, it's of course sent to the other for consideration. More often, the chambers pass differing versions of a bill. But if neither chamber is willing to drop its version, then reconciliation of these differing bills is the job of a conference committee, which is different from a standing committee. In the conference committee, each chamber appoints a conference delegation that includes members of both parties, usually people who worked in the committee on the bill in their respective chamber. And in the conference committee, they work out their differences on the bill. Now, if differences can't be reconciled, the bill dies. But this outcome is pretty unusual because if the bill gets as far as a conference committee, it probably has enough support to make it through. The president gets the bill after Congress passes the legislation, both chambers. But the president has the choice of signing the bill into law or ignoring the bill. Of course, the result of ignoring the bill means that the bill becomes a law in 10 days, not counting Sundays. Or the president can just veto the bill. If the president vetoes, Congress can respond with a congressional override. But an override requires a 2/3 vote in each chamber, and because of that, it rarely occurs. In general, there's a real bias against legislative action because the bias is in favor of the status quo. So it's easier to kill a bill than to pass one. And as you look back and you see, the passage of a bill requires a sustained sequence of victories. Opponents only need to win once for the bill to be killed. So it's really quite difficult to pass a bill. This concludes the supplemental online lecture for Chapter 6. As usual, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, see me after class, or see me during my office hours.